Hello, everybody. It's Peter. Peter with an I, S-T-A-W-A-R-T. And welcome to segment 36 of...
I don't know, the Dark Tower, I guess?
Nobody was answering the phone in the security office as Nancy made it to the end of the fence gallery and dug through her pockets in search for her keys to undo the lock that secured the terminal end of the enclosed shelter. When she saw that someone else was waiting for the bus, she felt a little bit better about being out there alone. The person's back was turned, so she couldn't tell who it was, but she could tell it was a woman from the long black hair and the black clothing, which looked a little bit tattered. Nancy undid the lock and let herself out. She locked the gate up again and put her keys back. It struck her as odd that the other woman that was standing out there didn't turn and acknowledge her. From under the street lamp, Nancy could see that her hair hadn't been washed or combed. For such a long time, it had begun to naturally crimp and damage. Nancy assumed that maybe it was a street person, which would explain the bizarre behavior. Headlights appeared over the crest. From the motoring sound, she could tell it was the city bus. It turned the corner into the lot and approached their stop, which came as a relief to Nancy, who was beginning to get the creeps. Nancy stepped over to the edge of the curb, ready and willing to get into the tin armor of the bus and the safety of her seat. The woman moved over and stood right behind her. It made Nancy very uncomfortable, having a stranger standing in her space, so close, at night, and without her being able to see. But Nancy knew she was just waiting, like she was, to step on board. She couldn't know for sure, but she felt like the person was looking at her from behind, staring at the back of her head
and the nape of her neck.
It was a relief when the bus squeaked to a stop. The door opened, and Nancy stepped on as the driver checked his clipboard. Nancy paid her fare and started down the aisle, glad that she was inside and there was a third human being around. Without warning, there was a horrified shout, and the bus lunged forward, knocking her to the floor. The third person, the woman who had been waiting with her at the bus stop, was left behind. The bus driver was unable to form any words as he cried out and stomped on the gas pedal. He screeched out of the parking lot at dangerously high speeds, up the road, breathing at a frantic pace, threatening to hyperventilate. He was deaf to the roaring of the engine. The only thing that reminded him that he needed to shift was the gas pedal, which failed to make the bus go any faster even though he had it pressed all the way down. Holding onto the support bar, Nancy lifted herself to her feet. "What's the matter?" she asked. "Did you see that?" he asked, racing up the road in the opposite direction of the bus route. "No, what?" she asked with a sick, numb feeling in her belly, like a rat was trying to eat its way out of her stomach. The bus driver couldn't find any words to express himself. He held his chest and tried to settle down for fear he might pass out. He drove her back to the bus yard and dropped her off there, so someone else could take her home personally. He trotted out to his car, drove to his house, and stayed there. He called into work and quit 3 hours later.
The blood in your veins is amongst the sweetest I've ever tasted.
Mask Dumwano Dariola Spacito-Rupuno Mask Dumwano Siso Baso Dariola Spacito-Rupuno.
Chapter 34. Nancy had stayed late that evening, not only because she had a tremendous amount of filing to get done, but more so because she wanted to stay until everyone else had gone, at which point she could do a thorough search of the entire top floor to find her missing teeth, or at least find clues as to where they were. The secretary had mentioned that the dentist usually stays in his office a lot later than everyone else. She also mentioned how a person could know, beyond the shadow of a doubt, whether or not he was in, because whenever he's alone in the office, he always sits high in his dentist chair. If a person were to look really hard from down below, they could see him wearing his crown through the plate glass windows. This turned out to be a valuable snippet of information as Nancy, Frank, and Joe made their way across the lawns lining the clinic that night. Nancy didn't mention the strange ordeal about the bus taking off so quickly earlier that evening, leaving the other passenger behind. She knew that the woman standing behind her might not be attractive or have less than average looks, but the driver didn't have to scream and tear off. It must have been a terrible shock to her ego. She probably went home that night and cried. They made their way inside, wearing their specially painted jumpsuits and face paint. After releasing Callie, they pinned themselves flush to the wall and sidestepped, keeping as flat against the sides as possible. They had painted their faces and jumpsuits salmon pink with black speckles, so they matched almost perfectly with the polished granite walls. Earlier on, they had tried covering themselves with vanishing cream, but it didn't work. It must have been old. In response to the sound of the door opening and closing, the security guard came strolling out. He tried to act calm, but his heart was racing. The prospect of a burglar didn't scare him as much as the fear he had of the unknown. Fear of the unknown was why the protective cyclone galleries leading out to the parking lots were added onto the building. He used to think it was just a bunch of mumbo-jumbo, all that talk about creepy goings-on around the grounds of the clinic and in the nearby woods underneath the highway trestle that spanned over the swampy depression. In the second month that he worked as a night security guard at that place, there was a thunderstorm, and that's when he heard the howling screams during each quaking rumble of thunder. A few people who worked late said that in the past they had seen things during the flashes when the lightning lit up the night. Hours earlier that evening, the owner of the place, the dentist, came down acting all crazy, swearing he'd seen something outside, a dark shadow prowling about. And now, security guard Lewis heard the door opening and closing, which wasn't good. To his relief, he spotted Callie. "Why, hello there," he said, picking her up. Callie meowed. He opened the front door and let the cat out, knowing that in the morning, when somebody opened one of the terminal ends of the fencing, the cat would be released. As the door closed, the cat strolled down the steps, but then stopped. With its tail bushy and its back arched, it hissed. Bony white fingers, whose flesh had a plastic quality, released their hold around the wires of metal. The chipped and broken fingernails disappeared into the black shawl, and the shadow walked back into the night, limping, and from pale white lips, which had chapped so severely that the flesh had cracked, physically separating the lips in places, there came a hissing whisper, "Nancy." After the security guard had passed, 3 sets of eyes embedded in the wall opened. When the security guard went back into his office,